Hello everyone. I'd initially intended to bring you a different video today, but instead of what I'd initially planned, we're jumping straight in to have a look at the number 1 Mark II NBC Overboots. So this is a follow-up to the previous video. We're going to compare these to those which I believe are the first issue boots, which we had a look at in the previous video. We're going to look at the design changes that were made to these. Of course, they form part of the British NBC, or Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Protective Clothing, which included the charcoal lined suit, and we've had a look at some examples of those previously on the channel. And of course gloves will be worn as well, and the respirator, and you have these boots to cover the combat boots. So they're a pair of overboots designed to be worn over the regular footwear, which for most at this time would have been the DMS ankle boots with ankle puttees, of course. So without further ado, we'll get into the main part of the video and have a look at these in some detail. So here they are. We're first going to have a look at these in their primary standard package, and this is the plastic bag in which these would be issued. You can see here we have a date of November 1975 on these, and that's the packing date for these. The various other details on the label here, you have the NATO stock number at the top there, and then the vocab number underneath that, and then the designation Overboots NBC number 1 Mark II, and then you have the contract number there, as you can see, and obviously quantity 1 pair, and you can see the details there, primary standard package, and the reverse of the label gives the fitting instructions, which basically tells you how to put these on. The packaging is a heavy-duty plastic bag. It's notched at this end for ease of opening, for tearing that end open. And the boots are kept together inside with a rubber band, which, as you can see, has perished, unfortunately, inside there. And you can see some detail here. We've got the beginning of a tread pattern, a sort of fairly weary attempt at a tread pattern on the bottom of these, but they are otherwise very similar to the previous examples we looked at, as already mentioned. So these appear in the mid-1970s, were used through to the late 1970s. The designs obviously did advance, but older marks of both the suits and the boots and so forth were kept in stock and used for training and so forth. So you would see quite a lengthy crossover period between each change from one mark to another. That's just something to note here. So there we are, that's the boots in their packaging. We'll move on now to have a look at a pair of these outside, we'll move on now to have a look at a pair of these removed from the packaging, and also take a look at the instructions as well. So here we have the pair of them. What I'm probably going to do is remove one of them to talk about one individually. As I say, they aren't a handed pair, as we saw previously with the previous design. These are just two issued identical to make up a pair. So if I remove this one for the moment, we'll have a look at this individual boot here. We have the laces attached here, and one of the differences is that this is fitted with, this designer boot is fitted with standard sort of flat shoe laces, as you can see here. So we've now got these cotton flat shoe laces in place of the rubber ones we saw previously. The construction is otherwise very similar, as you can see. We have a glued upper section, as you can see there, seam front and rear, as you can see, and this is made of the cloth reinforced rubber we saw on the previous design as well, as you can see there, glued seam at the front there. The sole is then glued to this. Now this is no longer of cloth reinforced rubber, as you can see, it's just a thick gauge of rubber. And a detail you can see on the sole here as well is the stamp of the manufacturer, BP. Interestingly, we saw BP as an ink stamp on the previous design, which we looked at in the previous video, and then we have the date here of 1976, as you can see, and this is mirrored on the paper label for these as well, showing both the manufacturing date and a packaging date of 1976. And then at the bottom here we do have a tread, a bobble tread, as you can see, which isn't great, but it's better than the smooth soles we saw previously. Otherwise the design of this is very, very similar, with an eyelet on each side and one front back, as you can see there. And these are reinforced rubber. They're just a thicker section of rubber, as you can see there. They're no longer metal. So that's a slight simplification of the design, I guess you could say. The additional detail of the tread, but simplification here with these being made of just the thicker rubber, which for something which is designed to be basically disposable if it's actually used in its intended role. Obviously in training these would be used and reused, but in its intended role these would be disposed of once contaminated. That was the idea. You don't want something that's too expensive to manufacture, so cutting down on the use of metal makes a lot of sense. You can see here that the lace is just looped through the front eyelet on these, and we'll have a look at the lacing diagram for these now. I'll bring that into shot. So this is the label that came with these boots, and this had a March 1976 date, as you can see, when they were packaged, when that's the packing date there. And on the back of this you have the instructions for fitting. So if you'd like to pause here and read this, you can, but you do have the diagram at the bottom there, which is very useful, which I tried to illustrate last week from memory with the previous design. I have this basically laced as it should be here. So you've got the lace coming back from the front eyelets to the outside of the outer eyelets, coming in, crossing over in a twist at the front here, looping round to the rear eyelet there, and then you would tie this off back round to the front here. So hopefully you can follow that from this lacing diagram. And as I say, you can pause here to have a look at this should you wish. But this is the way you lace up these boots, and this would remain very similar throughout. You basically end up getting more eyelets added around the edge on later designs, and the tread gets modified a bit as well, but we'll see that in future videos. So that's the lacing diagram for these. What I'm going to do now is bring in an example of the previous design we looked at and compare directly to these boots. So on the right here we have what I believe to be the first issue NBC Overboots, and then on the left here we have the number 1 Mark II, as you can see. So I'm positing that these were number 1 Mark I, but I don't have any documentary evidence to support that. That's just sort of logical deduction from these being number 1 Mark II. Comparing these, they are very, very similar. They're about the same height, so a little difficult to show you on camera, but they are roughly the same height. They come the same distance up the calf, I guess you could say. The uppers are very similar in being glued onto the lower, the sole, and obviously the shape of the sole, as you can see here, is pretty much identical. Just you've got that deletion of the metal eyelets, as you can see there, rubber. If we turn these over, that's even more clearly illustrated. As you can see here, if we get these side by side, you can see they're basically identical in terms of shape, but you have this bobble tread pattern added on as an improvement to the design. But otherwise these two are very similar. As I say, again, the sole of the what I believe to be the first issue, if I keep this sort of on the right side as they were originally, is made of a slightly thinner cloth reinforced rubber, as you can see there, and then the number 1 Mark II here is made of a slightly thicker sort of solid rubber without the cloth reinforcement in it, as you can see there. So it's just made of rubber, it doesn't have that cloth reinforcement, that texture to it, as you can see there, the difference between the two. So very, very similar, as I say, but the number 1 Mark II, a slight improvement over the initial issue which we have here. We'll move on, I say, in the next video to look at the follow-on design to this, which is very similar but tries to improve issues which were encountered with the design, and I'll talk a little bit more about those now. So talking about the effectiveness of these, they were not a very effective design in terms of mobility. They really restricted a soldier's mobility. For one thing, even with the sole drawn up around the boot and tied tightly, there's a tendency for the boot to move inside these. Also, the tread pattern is really inadequate. This does not give enough grip. So they were basically acknowledged as being useless for moving and fighting in. They were fine in static situations, and they do act as an overboot. They do protect the footwear worn inside them, and the lower leg, of course. But for providing an overboot which actually allows you to move around effectively, these do not fit the bill. But then again, they're also being designed to be simple and disposable and cheap to make, because the idea is these would be disposable. Obviously in training scenarios they weren't, they would be reused, but if they were ever used in a contaminated environment, they would then be binned. That was the idea eventually, if they were actually used in anger, I guess you could say, in action. So they're a compromise in that regard, but really not a good design in terms of actually moving and fighting whilst wearing them. So that is something to note here. But that's a look at the number 1 Mark II NBC Overboot. So I hope you found it interesting looking at these and obviously comparing them there to what I believe came before. We'll be having a look at further designs of NBC Overboots, how the design was further improved, or at least how attempts were made to improve the design. So we'll be having a look at those in future videos as well, of course, continuing this sort of series, looking at the overboots, this NBC footwear. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, and the future videos in this series in particular, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It really is greatly appreciated. As I always say, thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.